rooted in Bermudian history in so many ways, a colonial structure that was turned into a prison, the site at which Buck Burrows and Tacklin were hanged in a fight of resistance, and a site that is currently being transformed into a site of memory by the National Museum. And when I think about critical Black memory, I think about sites of memory that are important touchstones for Black people that can be used to resist white supremacy and resist colonialism, that can move us towards decolonization, and sites that correct the historical record and the historical record that has been given to us by colonizers and by people who are our oppressors. But I also think about sites of memory not just as architectural structures, but also the way in which we move throughout space. And I think the best example of this are the gumbays. They are memory workers, and they occupy space. And I think the best way to do that is when they move throughout the built environment, taking up space, stopping movement from happening, and encouraging us to just watch and participate. And the way that they take up space, and the way that they take up space and encourage us to stop and occupy space, I think is an important example of decolonization, if even for that moment. So with that, I would like to just I challenge us to think outside of just statues and what we think of as monuments, but also think of how we occupy space and how we can do that as a way to move us towards decolonization and undoing white supremacy. So I'm going to toss it over to Dr. Warren, who can speak about how she thinks about memory, and then we'll just have a brief introduction from both of the panelists, and then we will move into a more casual conversation about memory and how it can help us to get free. So thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. I appreciate it. I'm really happy to be here this evening to speak with Stephanie and Theo. I know Clarence was on the invite, and some may be wondering where he is. He wanted to be here, but had some technical difficulties. For a few years now, throughout lockdown, Theo, Clarence, and I have had conversations, and I feel my biggest problem will be tonight to remember that I'm speaking to an audience, not just to friends. Yes, and that's a nice problem to have, I think, to know that I have found support with other Bermudian academics who are trying to think through similar issues, sometimes from different time periods or different angles, but all, as Stephanie said, with the aim of thinking towards liberation and true liberation and for me, part of that is about freeing our imaginations. So I'm an historian, definitely, but I'm also trained as a sociologist, and I spent a lot of time, like Stephanie said, thinking about how do we create spaces of memory. And one of the things for me is kind of undoing the power that disciplines hold over us in the academy. And some of that is through interdisciplinary work, but some of it is also through what Christina Sharp calls becoming undisciplined. So really thinking beyond what the academy tries to make us do in kind of compartmentalizing knowledge and experience. And I just wanted to read a quick couple of sentences, because I don't think I can say it better than Haitian scholar Michel Rolfe-Trio, who said, within academia itself, we need to cross disciplinary boundaries much more often than we do. Today, no single discipline has the capacity to conceptualize the experience of the people dismissed by the 19th century. And then he goes on to quote anthropologist Eric R. Wolf, who wrote in 1982, and I'll quote, "It is only when we integrate our different kinds of knowledge that people without history emerge as actors in their own right. When we parcel them out among several disciplines, we render them invisible. And by talking about people without history, it's not literally people who don't have a past. It means people who have been excluded from the discipline that we know as history. And if we understand how history started, how all the disciplines started in the 19th century, at a time of high imperialism, where only certain people's lives mattered, and that there was a scale of how people's lives mattered, then we have to be really cautious of using the tools of these disciplines to try and understand our past, especially as people of the African diaspora. And it doesn't mean we throw all the tools out. Some of them are useful. I go into the archive all the time. But as you said, Stephanie, it's not enough. It's limited. If we only use the archive, we're getting a very skewed idea of who we are. We're getting an idea of who we are through the lens of people who didn't think that we matter, who didn't feel that we were human beings.
Thank you so much for that. And there are a lot of things I want to come back and touch and speak about. I was nodding vigorously and taking notes vigorously. So I jotted down some things that we can circle back to, but I would love to invite Dr. Francis into the conversation before we cycle back in. Thank you.
Good afternoon once again, everyone. Sorry, just trying to find my page. I had my presentation up and I was just trying to find it. How do I share this presentation once I kind of get myself a little organized? Just simply share screen?
Yes, just share screen.
Okay, all right, excellent, excellent. Good afternoon once again, everyone. My name is Dr. Theodore Francis from Warwick, graduate of Warwick Academy, and then went on to Morehouse College and did my doctoral degree at University of Chicago. And I'm currently employed at Abilene Christian University, way out in West Texas, where I teach classes on African American history, African diaspora history, with a focus on the Caribbean, as well as classes on U.S. history. Thank you once again for inviting me to today's panel discussion. And I think, appreciate shout out to my sister scholar there, Dr. Warren, but I think I want to take us in the direction of music to maybe for us to reflect on this. I'm not very skilled with the YouTube piece, so I just put up the lyrics to the song, and you can, if you know it already, you can hum along, or if you don't, maybe you can just search it online, whatever your music format you like to work with. That's me. I think this is it. Yes. Big screen. Can we all see this? Hopefully we can all see this. Several years ago, it was an artist out of the island of Jamaica. In fact, the son of another reggae music artist, Chronixx, who came out with his band, Chronixx and the Zinc Fence Band, and they dropped an album or mixtape known as Dread and Terrible. And on the mixtape was a very poignant song that I think speaks to some of these issues of memory, trauma, and Black resistance. And the song was titled Captured Land. And just read out the lyrics. He said, Lord America, capture land. The whole of Jamaica, a capture land. Long time them want trick the Rasta man. Like them not know, say man a real African. You think me not remember King Ferdinand and Defin Columbus had a golden plan. They make a wrong turn, end up in the Caribbean. One Ras genocide, kill enough Indian. Turn paradise into a plantation and bring cross one shipload of Africans. Now here comes the thief and queen from England. She Cromwell and Henry Morgan. Century upon top of century, full of separation. Now after 400 years, he say no reparations. And now they want to kill you with the taxation. But I beg you, please take me to the motherland. They tell you, and then it reverts back to the chorus. For those of you familiar with the song, you know this is a big tune. I'm sure air horns would be blaring, lighters would be in the air if this was a different context. But since this is a professional academic conference, let's dial it back. I think Mr. Chronixx raises some very important points here. Of course, it's a snapshot history that makes reference, of course, to colonial colonization, right? It makes reference to seeing a moment that one group would say is discovery. Oh, Columbus discovered the Americas. Oh, he discovered the Caribbean. He discovered this, he discovered that. And he's reframing, which lets us know that historical events are oftentimes embedded within disparate narratives. And we see that right here in Bermuda. From our love for talking about Bermuda's maritime history, but oftentimes not really getting into what are some of the products which are being moved around the Atlantic world during Bermuda's so-called glorious era of maritime history. Some of those products were African men, women, and children being trafficked back and forth, as well as indigenous people coming out of Virginia. Shout out to the St. David's Islanders, right? As well as others throughout the island. Consequently, what this song, Captured Land, points us towards, or what I would like for it to point us towards, is for us to really kind of unpack the problematic histories which are embedded in some of the things that we oftentimes venerate, right? And this idea of trauma and resistance are oftentimes taking place at the same time. And folks are looking at the same location, but through radically different lenses. Radically different lenses, all about the same event or same time, right? That's kind of my, on the other kind of panel is, or the other column is more so an academic kind of breakdown for this idea of a captured land. And shout out once again to Mr. Chronixx, because Chronixx identifies Bermuda, because he lists a whole host of Caribbean as well as North American territories that he said are captured lands. What is he saying? These spaces which have been occupied by European colonizers and developed into a thing, a world, a society, as if they weren't societies and with real people, with real civilizations prior to European conquest. But the ways in which we're oftentimes trained in popular schooling and popular education is to look at these places as tabula rasa, like nothing more happening until Europeans in a boat showed up in the 1400s or 1500s to discover and settle or civilize a space, right? And Bermuda being one of those spaces. And even though we might enjoy a certain quality of life, and that of course depends on your class and age and economic positionality within Bermuda, we still have to grapple with the ways in which so much things and so much places, even within Bermuda, are troubled by histories that give one community of people trauma and invoke histories of resistance to another community of people. Moving right along with that same set of ideas, this is just, of course, an image from, of course, Chronixx and the Zinc Fence Band and the Dread and Terrible album. Go check it out. No, I'm not getting paid by them, but if I got free tickets to his concert, I wouldn't say no, right? But let's think about a few just basic ideas. This idea of collective memory. Who is the collective that is having these recollections? And as I said before, we can have one space that is burdened by different sets of ideas, different sets of memories or histories. We understand the layered nature of events. Identity is critical. And then we've also got to think about, it's a concept that I like to teach or like to reflect on, and I think it's germane to our discussion, is it's a scholar by the name of Patricia Seed. She dropped a book several years ago known as Ceremonies of Possession, European Conquest of the New World, right? And she has this concept known as rituals of possession. How do folks take hold of a space? How do they lay claim to a space? And I know we can think about that very legalistically in a 2023 context and say, oh yeah, well, you know, if you want to buy a piece of real estate, you go down to said real estate company, you discuss the fee, you exchange the money, you hold on to the deed. Well, that's a ritual of taking possession. But we also have a lot of informal rituals of taking possession, which we argue are just as real, right? We don't like to talk about the gang problem, but sometimes there's gangs, sometimes there's street groups in Bermuda, and hey, they take possession of territory as well too. They might not have a legal deed that they can go down to HSBC with, but they have ownership of that space. How do they have ownership of that space? Let's get out of that area and let's move into something much more popular. 24th of May and Cup match. Guess what? People's out camping. How do we take possession of the area where we're going to put our tent? We know that they are socially accepted ways of marking out your territory. Whether you're over on Cedar Avenue with a piece of chalk, or nowadays people use tape, right? They use tape and then they be writing their name. When back in the day, they used to send you down there for field insurance. You have to sit down there because your auntie told you sit down there because that's gonna be our spot on the corner. You sitting down there all evening, all night till your next relative comes relieve you. What ritual do we use to lay claim to space? Whether you go to the cup match game in the East or whether you go in the West, how do you identify who your favorite team is? And this is my team area. I ain't gonna say the names because then people's gonna say I'm partisan because I'm gonna say certain team first, like, you know what I mean? But yeah, nah. So these are some of the things we can think through, how we have these rituals of taking hold of things and how have they changed? What are rituals from the past? What are rituals from the present? And what are maybe some rituals that we can carry into the future? Because at the end of this year, this is why history is absolutely critical. Just want to wrap with that. Because this history matters. It matters way more than just simply memorizing some dates or some events that I can share with you. History is plugged into an individual and a community's understanding of what is possible in society. And if we don't grapple with these things, it's going to affect how we look at trauma and how we frame resistance, or whether or not we discuss these things at all, or even replicate them into the future. That's my time. I appreciate you. And I look forward to discussing this a little bit more.
Thank you so much. There's so many avenues that we can go, and I'm really excited about this. I'm trying to square the circle to have you both talk about, so to condense it because we only have so much time. I could talk to you all for 5 hours, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time. And I think the thing that I keep hearing from the both of you is the past making itself present in our present, and how that happens both through our physical understanding of space and I guess our mental understanding of space. Christy, you mentioned the archive and how that is a space and a site, right? Even though it's not, well, it also is a physical site, but it takes up a mental and intellectual space. And then Theodore, you mentioned just the rituals that take place in space. And I would love for you to both talk about, I think you touched on it, but I would like for you to expand, if you could, Christy, about the violence of the archive, and then we can talk, and then we can move to the violence of displacement of people that you alluded to, Theo. So we can go start there. Actually, sorry, and also to save time, then if you could tie into how we can get ourselves free from both of those things. That way we can, okay. I know that's so much, but that way, I'm looking at the time and I'm like, how can we do this and allow for some Q&A? So if you can, yeah. And you can
maybe we can just have a chat with each other.
Yeah, that works.
See how these things talk to each other.
That out so then you can
yes.
Go back and forth. Yeah.
So someone I go to a lot when I'm thinking about the violence of the archives is Saadia Hartman, who writes, and I'm finding a lot, the people that I draw on actually aren't trained, aren't within history departments. They're dealing with archival documents and histories and thinking about the past, but they're coming at it from a different angle than historians often do. And historians are now starting to draw on them. So it's interesting to watch that happen. But with Saadia Hartman, she talks about a couple of things, one called racial calculus and the other called political arithmetic, that were entrenched centuries ago. So, but that live into the present. So that idea of trying to separate the past from the present doesn't work. And I was talking to, I don't think he minds me saying, my brother today, talking about this relationship between the past and the present. And he works in psychology. So he was coming at it from a psychological point of view about how people who are trapped in the past kind of are stuck with depression, people who kind of are looking to the future often have anxiety, this idea of not being present. So for me, in getting past this problem of being stuck in the past is understanding this connectivity between the past, present, and future. How do they connect and kind of influence each other? And I think a lot of the problem is that we don't acknowledge how much of the past is still with us, how much it underpins the things that we understand to be true, the things that we take for granted. In the same piece that I was talking about from Trio, he was talking about the North Atlantic fictions of universalism. And to break that down a little bit, like these things that we take for granted as being true for everybody are not. They're constructed. they're made up to benefit certain people. And when we don't spend time kind of digging under them and accepting the story as it's kind of been presented or preserved, that's when we run into problems. And that's part of when I'm talking about the violence of the archives. That's what I'm talking about, because that racial calculus and political arithmetic, that kind of, she's talking about it in math, but I always think about it kind of in acrobatics, this kind of positioning and moving that people have done to keep create and keep a certain social order is still with us. And that exists within the archives, that echo of that past social order.
Yeah.
So Saadia Hartman wrote an article called Venus in Two Acts, where she thinks through a story of, Theo, you know this story? Here's let me go. You can correct me if I go off too far or get it wrong. Where she talks about she had been writing a book and she came across a story of enslaved girls on a ship, and her reaction was basically to try and almost to rescue them from the past.
Right.
And like this idea that actually that's not possible. And she kind of develops this idea called critical fabulation. Yeah. So this way of engaging with these violent archives by remembering that they're human beings, by approaching them as human beings ourselves, meeting other human beings, that we're not going to take what the archive says as the end of the story, as the limits of the story, that the fact that we can't get at their voice from the archives is a limit, that we can't get at their emotions and their feelings about this is a limit. So for me, it's thinking about, like Theo was talking about, for me about moving towards freedom is thinking about, well, how have people in the African diaspora chronicled and remembered the past themselves? Right. And we get to the things that we've already started talking about. We have the Gombes. That is a form of memory in the present. It's a continued ceremony. It's a continued form of resistance. And it's something that changes as well. If we look at the ways the Gombes look today, that's not the same as they did in the earliest 20th century. It's definitely not what Gombes looked like in the 19th century. So it's not a static kind of monument, if we're thinking about that. It's not like a statue, or it lives. It's actual people living and breathing and kind of bringing these stories and extending these stories in the present.
Nah, yeah, I let me just jump in on that, because I appreciate you bringing up Hardeman, because my wife introduced me to reading her, so respect, right? And I appreciate you raising her, because again, this to put Hardeman's framing, or at least a version of Hardeman's framing, in conversation with that Amos Wilson quote I dropped earlier. It's like the history is at the core of the consciousness, right? You know what I mean? Not to go all off in kind of abstract, but it is. It's like how we think about concepts. When you tell somebody, well, maybe we shouldn't do that. Well, that's not possible. Not to resurrect. Well, yeah, not necessarily resurrect, but I'll revisit. Very recently, myself and Dr. Tito Swan were involved with doing the commission of inquiry work, and obviously the outcome of having a historical inquiry into the problematic nature of those land dispossessions, we'll say that, those land grabs, is the next is an ethical or moral question. Well, shouldn't there be some type of restitution? Shouldn't there? And you heard this kind of almost knee-jerk type of response of, oh, that's not possible because this, because that, and a third, right? And what is forgotten is the history of reparations first being deployed to compensate slaveholders in this island, Bermuda. in this island,
Yeah.
Bermuda, not outer space, in this island, Bermuda.
Mhm.
And, and it was more slaves
Right.
than it was people dispossessed
Mhm.
in Dakar or in St. David's.
Mhm.
But that's not possible. Meanwhile, this is. So once again, 2 years, it's like, and Hardeman's idea of critical fabulation involves what? It's only fabulation or kind of the exaggerated, or we could even say fantasy, sci-fi, et cetera, because it is bestowing, not it only, one of the reasons why is because it bestows a level of humanity and a level of dignity and respect, and sometimes economic compensation for categories who have been so historically dismissed, meaning Black people and poor people primarily, and women, that it is almost unimaginable. And that is definitely where we see we're prisoners of a certain kind of history. Prisoners, even the biggest, most conscious, well-educated people, but very prisoners of these concepts of literally thinking inside the box. And I recognize the irony of that as I say this on Zoom, because someone will be listening to this from inside a box as they hold a phone and look at me inside a next box, box upon box. But I still gotta say it.
Yeah. I think the thing that excites me about Hartman's idea of critical fabulation is the way in which it kind of expands the bounds of academia, and it challenges the way in which we are trained to think about history and write about history. And I think that gives us an example of how we can get free from the disciplines, right? And this is a really big question, but it ties kind of back to what you were saying, Theo, about the thing that's holding us is a lack of, I don't want to say a lack of imagination, because I don't think we have a lack of imagination, but a lack of being willing to imagine, right? And being willing to challenge, I guess, discipline and authority. And that brings me to like, how can we think as academics? I think of myself as someone who is thinking us free. And I don't want to say that, that's a little that has hubris to it, but imagine trying to point us in the direction of how we can think ourselves free, right? Which is also thinking a lot about what academics can do. But I guess in your work, how are you doing that idea of like getting us free through your work? And then how would you imagine, what would your ideal like site of memory be that could help us to move towards freedom?
That's so catchy. Christy, you want to jump in, or?
I'm thinking, Stephanie, at the moment a lot about everyday forms of resistance.
Right.
So I think the big kind of moments are really important, and I think that's something that we still need to discuss, because we still don't talk about them well enough. So I'm not trying to dismiss the big moments. It's something that we need to deal with. But I'm thinking about everyday forms of resistance, because I think the way that history has been constructed and the way that we've been led to think about the world, we devalue our everyday forms of just exerting our humanity in Bermuda. And Theo was saying something about Black people, poor people, women, like the idea of all the people that history has marginalized and continues to marginalize. How have we kind of worked to display and live to the fullness of our humanity of Bermudians? In what spaces has that happened? So we have that in kind of ritualized spaces like the gumbays and those types of things, but I think we also can find it in things that maybe don't sound as exciting initially, but I think they're amazing. So the pride that people take in their work, the craftsmen that we have in Bermuda who are amazing. It's a current kind of, I think I was telling you earlier this week, a current passion of mine to learn more about Bermudian craftsmen throughout the 20th century, cedar workers, shipbuilders. Milton Hill just did a piece this week on thinking about Bermuda's maritime heritage. That's something I'm really interested in at the moment as well. We've had for centuries, we have had people that have contributed to wider society whose contribution has not been valued. This idea of what type of work is important or not important or valuable has often been kind of been scaled against who has been exploited as well. So I think about that a bit. And I think about, if we think about the communities, if we connect that, I think, Theo, to what you were talking about, the communities that were displaced, a lot of the arguments for displacing was they weren't contributing enough, that they weren't using the land well enough, that the land could be used better by somebody else, which is a really kind of colonial tactic.
Yeah,
Of
1000%. Yeah.
Yes, what is productive, what is useful, despite the fact that they were making healthy communities, that they were happy, creating happiness, that they were supporting each other. And it's not like, I'm not trying to say it was some sort of utopia. I mean, I've heard, I've heard stories, like these places aren't perfect. They had their own prejudices, they had their own struggles and stuff like that. But these were real rounded human beings and full human lives. And I think spending some time validating that in the way that we think about our past and present, because that still exists. It's not like that's just a past problem. Is for me, that's part of resistance. And I know that sounds quieter, but that's really important in my work.
No, I think that's excellent. I appreciate you directing us towards the everyday, because I think one of the challenges of Bermuda too has been just the fact that we've been embedded within the kind of tourism economy for a little while, and not to fold that it's got its own sets of issues, but international business has its own set of issues. Large universities have their own sets of issues, and we can, parse out the details. But I think one of the challenges of tourism is sometimes it causes us to be outward facing and think about what's a historic monument, a site, an event that can be put on a postcard and kind of packaged and put on a postcard. So our approaches are kind of, it produces this kind of transactional approach to history as a thing, right? As an enterprise, not a thing, as an enterprise. Therefore, it's like, okay, if we can snap a picture of this rock and say something happened there, that's Spanish rock, maybe it's Portuguese rock, but we snap a picture of it and we put it on a postcard. Oh, this is where this shipwreck happened. Tourists want to see it. We snap a picture and put it on a postcard, and it then has the framing of history as an attraction for outsiders to look at and value, rather than history as a legacy for us to build on to, that give us some type of cultural understanding as a people. And those elements of history, they exist and they're there. But to your point, Christy, and I appreciate you raising it, is they're less venerated. They're just stories auntie tells you, or the stories your papa tells you, or your stories some other elder person tells you, but they're not necessarily treated with the kind of sanctity and reverence and the deservingness of building broader institutional programming around funding, with serious funds from and respect to Ministry of Cultural Affairs for organizing this discussion. So yes, this is going in the right direction. Appreciate that. However, at a broader sense, what happens with it, right? And oftentimes we see that at moments of large transition. Okay, recently, the schools were about to be changed up. So folks are saying, oh, wow, this particular school, I remember this teacher, back to these traditions of excellence, right? I remember this teacher, they had a strong influence on my life and they pointed me in this direction. So we have a variety of sites around Bermuda, whether it's schools, Sand Secondary. Some people remember, their elders might remember Temperance Hall, right? Howard Academy, and these other sites around the island, which really deserve to be not just marked with a kind of, a brass plaque or some type of statue, but also invested in to say, what were the skill sets and cultural practices that gave that space value? Myself, right now, I'm working on Black Tourism Project. Knock on wood, be done by the end of the year, because my publisher, they be emailing me, and I'm like the bad student who hasn't finished his homework right now. But working on a manuscript about Black tourism in Bermuda, and you've got a number of these places from Ripley, Canville, Archland Villa, Sunset Lodge. These are hotels that Black Bermudians created at a time when they were banned from the Castle Harbors and the Princess Hotels. So what type of business acumen do you need to do that at a time when Black folks can't march on to the bank on Front Street and get the biggest loan and do the biggest development? What type of business and saving skills? There's some skill sets these folks have. That's a history that we can pass on to young folks, that you don't need to send them to overseas, to Canada, America, or whatever, England, to get training in business savvy. You got some elders walking around this island right now, or maybe sitting in a rest home or convalescing in someone's back room, because they had that skill set. And doing that at a time of racial segregation.
Yeah.
And navigating diasporic networks to advertise. I think we could go on and on and on,
yes.
right?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that links to the idea of how to move towards freedom, that idea of using this. You have sites and letting people know where they are. But I agree with you, Theo. I was somewhere and I looked at a plaque and I was thinking, but people don't know this place. They don't know anything about it, what happened here, the people were, what their belief system was. And there was another place I went to this week that actually, I've been on a family reunion this week, and I've been learning about some of my ancestors. I knew a lot because I've done a lot of research, but I've learned more because I've been talking to other people. So I have different angles. I've got stuff that I wasn't able to know before. So it's once again that idea of collective knowledge, of sitting and talking. What did he call? What was that book called? Grounding with My Brothers. That idea of
Rodney.
Yes, Walter Rodney. That idea of a process of approaching these ideas that doesn't privilege one person's form of knowledge or one way of looking at the world, that we have to kind of approach these things in a collective way, in a community-minded way. So I was at First Church of God, Angle Street this week. So how many people know about Grant, who started Angle Street?
Exactly.
Who what he did when he did it in the 1920s. That was, and then coming out of that, the connection to that with the recorder, for instance, we still have Brownlow Place.
Yes, indeed.
And there are people talking to him. I know, I've seen articles in the paper. Snaith Simmons, I believe, has spoken to him a lot. But it's like, how much of this is kind of being integrated into the way that we think about ourselves now? And you're right, the idea of skill sets, of having this knowledge of a past that tells us someone like us has done this before. Not that long ago.
Indeed. Indeed.
Yes. And thinking about how we think about current kind of tools to help us move forward, because there's a lot, there's a lot that we can learn from the present as well.
Yes, most definitely. And I think also you're very right, because it's crazy. Stephanie raised this idea about academics having a way to think us into freedom, or think us into greater freedom. And I think that's useful. Yeah, respect to that. And I mean, people like Amos Wilson, people like you mentioned Walter Rodney, Dr. Walter Rodney out of Guyana, and several others have reflected on that work, right? But unless there's a conduit for this knowledge to actually have a material impact in these societies which we love or come from, how does the brilliant idea or the brilliant paper that you might write, Dr. Christie, how does that kind of funnel its way back to Bermuda? And likewise, too, is in recognizing these sites and then connecting to the people who kind of made their lives and made these innovations in Bermuda. You mentioned Grant, and of course, Grant with the Garvey movement, right? How does that impact not only Bermuda, but globally, right? Thinking about education, you've got people like Hudson, who ran a school in St. David's, right? And the folks that he impacted, you think about Temperance Hall, people like Dr. Eva Hudson, and being educated in these spaces and then going on to impact not just Bermuda history, but globally. These folks have a footprint internationally, So even just recognizing the traditions of excellence that have been born, raised, and shaped here in Bermuda. And that's what that history helps us to connect with, That's what that history helps us to connect with. Even likewise, like I said, individuals from Donald Smith's travel agency and Hilton Hughes travel agency. We just think, okay, people going abroad, but these men were helping Black Bermudians navigate travel overseas at a time when not only Bermuda was segregated, but also there was segregation in the States, So these histories have to be connected not only to these sites, but all these communities, but also that then uncovers these broader traditions of excellence, whether it's traditions of excellence in service that are occurring at the same time or sometimes before Black people are even allowed to work in some of the big hotels. Sometimes people are like, oh, you got excellent service because you worked at this Elbow Beach or Princess, well, what about people having excellent hospitality skills because they worked at Black Woodlawn guest houses? Now, that's an interesting frame of thought, but again, too, just helping us reconnect with the ways in which our own communities have stimulated very useful and very important skill sets that sometimes do not get recognized if we don't identify the places where these happen, but not only the places, to Krista's point, the people and the communities.
Yeah, I think you both raised really important points and touched on like the resistance in memorializing the everyday and heralding those who came before us in the everydayness of living while Black, right? And living under white supremacy and colonization, and the ways in which our ancestors have kind of given us a blueprint of how we can get ourselves more free each and every day. I am looking at the time, and I do want to give time for if there are any questions in the audience. If not, we can always go back to having such a rich conversation. Are there any questions? I have not been monitoring the chat. I think
I haven't actually seen any questions, but I'd remind everyone that they can also pose any questions in the chat or in the Q&A.
Okay. Oh, we can keep talking then. Not that I would love to have questions, but
I wanted to just pull in one other reference then, because
okay, yes, that'd be great.
Theo talking about tourism made me, I was thinking about history at that point, and something that I found really useful recently is well, there's a couple of things to think about. Like there's some really good writing from across the Caribbean from the 60s and 70s that it seems, and this is including Bermuda, that is like often out of print, inaccessible in other ways.
Yeah.
So this is one of the issues of trying to get at it. It's also then, how do you take this information, which is sometimes written not kind of in an accessible way? How do you then make sure that this information can be translated for wider audiences? And I'm thinking here especially about students kind of in islands like Sylvia Winter, or I'm thinking right now about Wilson Harris. He had a lecture series that was published in 1970 called History, Fable, and Myth. And he was talking about the importance of drawing on folk tradition, what people call folk traditions, fables, myths, and legends. As a process of getting more free. So it's once again to me about those things that academia, the discipline of history, dismissed as not important or kind of marginalized traditionally. But that for understanding who we are as a people and kind of going forward is really important. So I had forgotten at the beginning, I meant to show you my video. I'm not going to show it now. It's a bit too long, but I'll talk about the video I did with Amy Zanders really quickly.
Yes, that'd be great.
So that idea of Amy Zanders and I, for the biennial last year, did a video concerning Sally Bassett. And for us, it was really important that it was a non-linear narrative. So that means we layered over the information we had learned about her, about how she was remembered by Black Bermudians, and the way that she was I don't know if misremembered is a word, but
dismembered.
Yes, denigrated by specifically the tourism industry, where she was created into a bell and sold as a trinket in a tourist shop. So in this piece, we were thinking about those different layers of what happened to her and how that's remembered in Bermuda. And part of what we were trying to think about, and by not thinking about it in a linear narrative, is we don't get her voice ever. So what we're layering is how different people have thought about her and how she has been remembered. And then thinking about that against the archive, in which she is silent. And actually, in this case, she's silent by choice. She's given a chance to speak, and she chooses not to. And I see that as a form of resistance. Sometimes silence can be a form of resistance, and that she actually chooses who she speaks to. She chooses to save her voice for other enslaved people, for other Black people when she leaves it. And how do we know that? We know that through myth and folk tradition and story. Can we prove she said that? No. But does that matter? Equally no. Because the way that we kind of come to understand ourselves is made up of more than just what definitely happens. It's made up of how people understand themselves in time and space, and how they relate to certain figures in certain time periods. So the idea of the Bermudiana growing out of her ambers, for me, is an important symbol. People might say, oh, that never happened. Well, maybe it did, maybe it didn't, but it means it shows you a certain meaning that goes beyond what the archive could ever give us. And what we get is a her in place. So I guess part of the thing is, part of like living in the fullness of being is that things change over time. But what work are we doing to make sure really key things aren't forgotten? Really important traditions aren't forgotten. Like we talk about things now, even with language, about, oh, that's how older Bermudians speak. You can hear how I speak, or that isn't, like, there are things lost, and there are reasons for that. My own life experience has been very different. But how do we capture things that have been thought of as being Bermudian? And I think that's part of thinking about us being free as well, of us not of us respecting and valuing our culture.
I think oh, sorry
no I was just thinking back to like the 80s, when there was well, maybe not that far, I'm going back too far maybe, but this idea that Bermudians don't have culture.
Right. I was actually just about to go there.
Okay, go there. I'll start from that.
I think there's so much there's so many things I'm looking at the time, I'm like, how can I condense this really quickly? I think what you were touching on about this idea of myth and this idea of, and we've talked about this difference between history and heritage, right? And how those are not the same thing. And history is what we think of as like history with a capital H, and what is being written down, and how counter memory can kind of serve us to get free, and how we can create heritage, create history through mythology, through stories that we tell ourselves from our elders, from culture that lives around us. And the idea of Bermuda not having culture kind of is a way of dismissing that life that's underneath the history with a capital H. And I could go on and on about this, and I don't want to drone on, but
yes, sorry, I think you've brought that together really well.
No, I just to concur. I mean, I think in, just circling back to that set of concepts that Christy just shared, it's always this ongoing process and challenge, right? And as well too, even though there is resistance, it's never like a zero-sum game, right? Sometimes we're like, okay, the Enterprise in 1835 is resistance because the young guys got free. But what about all the multiple times of folks fighting against slavery and they didn't necessarily get free permanently, right? At least in a kind of unchained context of freedom, right? We talk about spiritual freedom, etc. at, till infinity, so to speak. But likewise, even just thinking back to the context of like Tucker's Ton and, the land grabs that occurred there by Bermuda Development Company and Furnace Withy. And, that whole ritual of possession, the ways in which these white Bermudian elites as well as British and American elites were empowered by the white British colonial power structure, as well as certain elites like Gosling and Sperling and others, to take that land, right, for the use of a segregated, to create a kind of segregated tourist resort. And the fact that there were numerous people who spoke out against it. They resisted.
Right.
However, the outcome didn't come out for them in a type of material sense whereby they were unable to keep the land, but they resisted, they complained, they kicked up, they tried to have separate tribunals. And there's numbers, not only just Dinah Smith, but you've got the Talbots and several others who make a big fuss about this, but unfortunately, they did not have the kind of power at that moment in a kind of legal or political sense to get their way. However, back to Krista's point, folklore once again, right? Dinah Smith is one of the last holdouts, and not only does she kind of stay in place, but we found records of her literally being put out of her place. Interestingly enough, more than likely by new white British police officers who had recently been brought to the island for the reason of creating more security on the island, because they felt that once Bermuda had been developed for more elite, and we'll just say rich white tourists, they felt that, hey, the police force needed to be improved. And improving it at that time meant getting white men from Britain to come down there and police the Black folks. And what's interesting is going back to that idea of folk stories, and what we sometimes think is just common is the old song that they said, or the rhyme that she used to say, that Goodwin Gosling is a thief, and everybody knows it, right? This kind of interesting little poetic song or rap or jingle that she had, returning back to this idea of use it. You would think I planned that, but this idea of us as a community, Bermuda embedded within the Caribbean, part of the greater Caribbean. And the use of these ways to speak to power, even though power didn't oftentimes listen. And power didn't necessarily move in the ways that these folks wanted, but it spoke back to power. And what do we remember from Dinah Smith? Well, the narrative says that we have an arrest warrant for her to be evicted. I can show you that. I found that in an archive. But anthropology reveals that, hey, Goodwin Gosling was a thief, and everybody knows. He carries Ronald Whistle, and Stanley Sperling blows it. So it's this idea of sometimes these folk traditions, those country, ordinary, everyday traditions, are the tools that we use to maintain a legacy, right? Whether it's a legacy of resistance, whether it's a tradition of pride of place, whether it's a tradition to say we stood up, even though we didn't get out of the way. Some days it's about standing up. So all of those traditions encapsulate sometimes into the things, the small H history, that the big H history sometimes didn't have time for.
Yeah, and making sure we don't overlook those everyday moments where we move closer and closer to freedom through everyday resistance, which I think has been the theme of tonight. I do have a question from the audience, and the audience member asks, in the political realm, we see a lot of talk about being a quote new day, and race being a factor in holding us back from making the right choices in our elected bodies. How can we hold space for a new day or progression whilst holding our elected officials accountable?
I think that's a big question. So maybe I'll tackle a bit of it, because Theory, look, if you're thinking. I think for me, part of it is it's to what we've been talking about. So the idea of race still being a factor holding us back. I think what's holding us back is an unwillingness to face how much the past is still in the present. So and so it's not just race, it's the constructions of society, of which race is an important factor in Bermuda. And when I'm teaching now, I go back to kind of the settlement in the Caribbean by colonizers, I talk to them about the construction of whiteness. I start with the construction of whiteness against the idea of blackness, and the idea of that these are structures that are created to maintain an elite. And this is still something we're struggling with, not with race, yes, but across the board, that we're still struggling with the idea that an elite finds ways to maintain itself. And who that elite is kind of can shift and change. But that's what I think we need to dismantle. How we can do this, it's a difficult thing to do because there's a vested interest in maintaining the order that exists.
Right.
Oh, indeed. I mean, thank you, because I'll take that segue, if you don't mind, Doc, and continue with that thought, because you're right. These systems that we feel say are the normative systems are also part of the problem, right? And the idea of a new day is marked by far deeper changes than just simply electing different named people with a different group of acronyms to occupy a seat of power, which was never ever constructed to deliver the level of justice that we might imagine, right? Because you've got, and I appreciate you sharing that, Christy, in terms of construction of whiteness and construction of these authority systems, right? We, on one hand, Bermuda loves to ring the bell and, we've got the oldest parliament operating outside of Britain, and, but that might also be a problem, right? That might also be part of the problem, and some of these structures, not some of these structures, the structure writ large, is part of the issue. And the reproduction of an elite, whether it is a all-white Front Street oligarchy, or whether or not it is a black oligarchy, or whether it's a kind of biracial oligarchy with corporate, offshore financing as its backers, whereas at a different moment it might have been, Front Street hotels as its backers. The specific identity of the players, we can save that for a broader discussion. But to speak to the person's question, I think we need to have a more clear-eyed understanding of the hold that those histories still have over us. The fact that they're not just washed away in the past ever since the PLP got elected in 1990 something, and hey, it's supposed to be a new day. And this is even why you've seen, once again, and our need again too, before I get down that road, even our need to have deeper conversations with our brothers and sisters in the Caribbean, whether it's officially through CARICOM or just socially through our own kind of social media or discussion groups. Why? Because the idea of a Black elite under a flag of independence reproducing some of the problematic behaviors of the white colonial establishment, we've got a track record for that. And we can see other pitfalls. And not to say that independence is not a desirable goal, most definitely, but it's also to help us recognize that you can also have Black people in a position whereby they exploit other Black people too, right? And this conversation is so layered, but it also touches back to something Dr. Warren mentioned as well too, with this idea of a better reverence or recognition of the everyday, instead of thinking about these grand things that, what is there rather within our cultural environment, within our societies, that is worthy of uplifting and valuing, right? So that we can produce a kind of social change that is beneficial, not just Bermuda as a whole, but the people at the lesser ends of Bermuda, whether that's economically, whether that's socially, however we construct it, right? Because creating more justice within the whole society uplifts the entire society. You know, not just making a couple of guys at the top rich, like, okay, and one of their friends too. Okay, great. So I was their friend this year, so I'm gonna vote for them. But what happens when I'm not their friend? You know what I mean? What happens when the paper I publish ticks them off and they ain't my friend anymore? You know, so thinking about these bigger ideas of social justice, it becomes a challenge, but again, it's embedded within the ways in which we kind of reverence these structures of power which Brian never created to give us liberation in the first place.
Thank you so much for that. I'm looking at the time, and I just want to close with one question that I guess can once again challenge our imagination. So if we're thinking about widening our understanding of what monuments, memorials, and sites of memory can be and what they should be, what would you, like, if I were to give you some money now to create a site of memory, what do you think we should use, and what can we use, or what can we choose to mark physical sites and commemorate our history as Bermudians?
I'm not trying to sidestep the question, honestly, but the first thing I would say is find out what Bermudians actually want. What do they want? What do Bermudians more generally want? How do Bermudians want to mark sites? And actually, for me, as part of a larger question is, do we want to continue marking sites? Because as I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of sites that are marked that we still don't know or understand. We don't understand the significance, you know. I was talking to my cousin today. It's like they come up maybe at a holiday, like it might be Heroes Day or something else, and we'll talk about it kind of on a surface level and we move on. So I still think for me, it's about embedding knowledge in community, embedding respect in ourselves, actually. We have a lot of physical memorials and statues and markers in the landscape for a very small country, and they're interesting. That's actually something, I'm not saying I don't think they're valuable at all. I have loads of photos of these markers that explain what everything means, but I also see that when I'm looking at them, other people are just walking by.
I mean, to add on to that, thank you very much for being the person who says, not no more statues, because I was afraid I was going to be the bear guy. But thank you very much, Jack. I maybe want to close or speak to that with how I started. Definitely utilize, and if there was some magic pot of money, to speak to Bermudians about what do they want, how do they want to memorialize things, for sure, but also building up the small H history. What about the interviews? What about funds for the musicians, artists, you know, and variety of artists, dance, painting, what have you, to produce things so that that information can keep circulating. I listen to American hip hop from time to time, and it's interesting that both younger generations and the kind of old school guys that I listen to both mention Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. How is it that that continuity of an African-American civil rights narrative has been reproduced? And we can speak to specific locations of reproducing that information, but what do our young people know about Dr. Paulu Kamakafigo, you know, Roosevelt Brown? You know, Dean Lewis Braun Evans, brother who just passed, may he rest in peace, Brother Otterwell Simmons, you know? And these other names who not only are individuals who had meaning to their families, but also worked very hard for the liberation of Black people at various points throughout Bermuda's history. How are those individuals and other groups and organizations, how are their names going to be able to be recirculated? Because it's in the sharing of this information. Once those individuals' names, as well as the types of worlds and freedoms that they work to create in Bermuda, Once those ideas become as powerful or as meaningful in the minds of people as God Save the Queen and a Union Jack and all that here, hey, that's when we'll see the kind of freedom that we believe we're imagining. But as long as the whole kind of God Save the Queen and that kind of colonial narrative is bigger and has more concrete weight in the minds of Bermudians, both old and young, you know, you can build the nicest and prettiest of statues. It'll be just like Dr. Warren said. It'll be pretty. Everybody will clap at the ribbon cutting. And then a week later, when you're on your way to the grocery store, you'll drive right across the D when you look. So it is the maintenance of the kind of historical narrative in the mind and the consciousness of the people that's more powerful. And that's the stronger monument, man. Yeah, that's the stronger monument, at least to me in this time.
Thank you. That was a really beautiful way to close. And I thank both of you for being here in conversation with me. I learned a lot. I'm sure everyone in the audience learned a lot. And I think we started a conversation that needs to continue to happen. I thank the Bermuda Community and Culture Affairs for hosting this for us, holding space for us to have a conversation of how we can move towards freedom. So thank you so much. And thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. You did an amazing job. And to all of our panelists, we welcome any feedback afterwards. We will be having the second panel discussion with creatives. We'll be announcing the panel members on the 10th of August with a similar format, because it's a beautiful segue from the question of how do we carry on and to how do our creatives imagine such memorializing and holding up memory can take place and in projecting into the future. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're really thankful for all of you. And I speak for a lot of people by saying we're really, really proud and grateful for you.